The Indefatigable class were one of those odd classes that were never actually meant to be. The Royal Navy, at this point in its history, had Admiral Fisher wandering its corridors and writing letters that usually came in all caps with multiple underlining, so it could be quite the exciting place to be, especially when it came to ship design. In 1907, the Invincibles were still under construction when his next big idea surfaced. A design forever only known to us as X4, with the presumed predecessors X1 to 3 being lost to us, which was basically HMS Dreadnought stretched out to massively increase machinery space, allowing it to hit a speed of 25 knots. Effectively, the first true fast battleship and a blending of the Dreadnought and battlecruiser concepts, at a time when most navies were scrambling to work out what HMS Dreadnought herself was all about. Fisher, however, appears to only have gone along with this design because everybody else in the Navy still had this weird thought that armour was actually important. But the design fell foul of financial constraints, as most other navies were still on pre-dreadnought inertia, and the costs of the ship were therefore not seen as justified, and the Bellerophon class was ordered instead. So he moved on to other options, the vast majority of which swapped the 12-inch 45 caliber guns for a more powerful 12-inch 50 caliber version, keeping around the same kind of speed as the Invincibles but rearranging the wing turrets to provide true cross-deck fire, whilst also upping the armour to either 9 or 10 inches, depending on the design, effectively preempting and in some ways improving over the design of SMS Von der Tann before Von der Tann had even actually been laid down. These were also deemed to be too costly, and indeed it was a fight to convince Parliament to authorise even one armoured cruiser of the conventional or dreadnought type, again on the grounds of cost. But finally, a potential threat, namely the Germans, began to respond to the construction of the first dreadnought-style vessels of the Royal Navy, and so a single dreadnought armoured cruiser was authorised, but only on a budget. As a result, the Royal Navy was forced to revisit an initial design that had been the baseline for the improved versions that they had considered. This was itself a slightly modified Invincible class whose main claim to fame was better cross-deck firing with similar protection. By the time this had been worked up to a level of detail acceptable for parliamentary scrutiny, the Admiralty had already drawn up a third set of designs, directed by Fisher, which were effectively, near as much as making no difference, the Lion class, which, if ordered around the time of their conception in early 1908, would have been ready for sea around about the same time as Von der Tann, which would have rather brutally leapfrogged that ship pretty much as effectively as the Invincibles had done to the Blucher. But instead, it was to be the runt of the design litter that was ordered as a single ship, Indefatigable. In some ways, it could be argued that she was actually weaker than the Invincibles, since to provide cross-deck firing and maintain her speed, the ship had been lengthened, but the citadel not so much, which left A and Y turrets protected not even by the 6-inch armour of their predecessors, but rather just 4-inch plating, with only the 2 en echelon turrets and the machinery spaces having the thicker protection. The next year, 1909, saw an imperial conference of the self-governing colonies and the UK. This was an attempt to distribute large ships across the empire for local defence, whilst also allowing the Royal Navy to concentrate at home against Germany. A scheme that would see ever larger attempts, which would also be failures, over the next few years, at least on paper. Of the 4 colonies, Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand, only the latter 2 signed up to some degree, with Australia ordering a capital ship for its own navy, and New Zealand ordering one for the Royal Navy to bolster general defence. For cost and continuity reasons, these were to be slightly modified versions of Indefatigable. One wonders at this point how history might have turned out had somebody let Fisher present his proto-Lion idea, but in any case, amongst various differences, these ships had the citadel end plating uprated to a whole 5 inches, which at least was better than the now class lead. The main battery remained as per the Invincibles, with 8 12-inch 45 caliber guns in 4 twin turrets, 1 fore, 1 aft and 2 en echelon amidships, with the aforementioned cross-deck firing capability at certain bearings. The secondary battery consisted of 16 4-inch guns in single mounts scattered throughout the superstructure, as opposed to in the Invincibles, where 8 of them had been rather jauntily placed on top of the turret roofs. Although these 16 would be reduced by a few in later refits as protection was increased to gun shields and casemates, which was a bit better than they had at launch, which consisted more of a pat on the back and a wish of good luck to the gunners. Some submerged torpedo tubes completed the weapons fit, although a few anti-aircraft guns would be added later during World War I. The ships were driven along by 4 shafts, powered by 43,000 shaft horsepower in Indefatigable and 44,000 shaft horsepower in the latter two, with a design speed of just over 25 knots, although the class would uniformly exceed both their power output and speed margins quite considerably on trials. Indefatigable was laid down in 1909, with New Zealand and Australia following in 1910. With the ships completing in 1911, 1912 and 1913 respectively. The latter 2 ships would sail for their name countries soon after completion, although New Zealand would return to the home fleet at the start of 1914. But on her tour she picked up 2 critical items, a Maori pendant and accompanying warrior skirt, both given to the ship to ward off evil in battle. The start of the war would find the 3 ships experiencing very different fortunes. New Zealand was dutifully helping the battlecruiser fleet in the North Sea. Australia was happily chewing up German colonies, whilst Indefatigable managed to fail to catch the Goeben, and then helpfully pointed out the deficiencies in the Ottoman defences of the Dardanelles by blowing a few of them up, which was something that would come back to bite everyone involved later on in the Gallipoli landings. However, with Goeben contained in the Black Sea and von Spee's squadron destroyed, all 3 ships would find themselves drawn back to the battlecruiser fleet, where New Zealand had already clocked up 2 battle honours at Heligoland Bight and Dogger Bank, with her captain opting to don the Maori gear and the ship subsequently receiving no damage. Unfortunately, a collision between New Zealand and Australia during anti-submarine manoeuvres sent the latter ship into dock for repairs starting in April 1916, and so the Battle of Jutland would see only 2 of the 3 ships present. Indefatigable was the first major casualty of the battle, where 2 separate volleys of shells tore her apart, resulting in the detonation of both the aft and fore magazines. Conversely, having equipped themselves with divine protection, New Zealand would end up fighting the battlecruisers Moltke, Von der Tann and Seydlitz, the battleship Prince Regent Luitpold, and a couple of German pre-dreadnoughts at various points during the fighting, coming out of it all with a single, non-damaging hit to its aft turret that caused no casualties. This may or may not have led to an increase in demand for Maori protective items from the rest of the battlecruisers. But after Jutland there was relatively little excitement for the 2 survivors. HMAS Australia managed to ram Repulse a year later, requiring minor repairs, before eventually heading back to her home country as the Royal Australian Navy's flagship in 1921, whilst New Zealand would spend 1919 and 1920 on tour before going into reserve and then being scrapped in 1922. Australia would end up being a victim of the Washington Naval Treaty and would be scuttled in 1924 just off of Sydney in order to comply with the treaty's terms.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.